who are not able to join this morning. Wonderful, thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday. Welcome to the 2020 Scaling Up Community of Practice Education Working Group webinar. We've also got some members, some colleagues from our Fragile States Working Group as well. So a lot of you have been part of conversations about the Education Working Group more broadly and what we can offer the Scaling Up Community of Practice and other colleagues who are not a part of this community. And with the COVID-19 crisis, we felt that we had a really powerful and purposeful role to play as convener and facilitator of information sharing and dialogue. And so that's really what we'd like to focus today's webinar on. So I'll just move forward. So I should also introduce myself, everyone. My name is Natika Talani. I'm a technical director with Management Systems International, MSI, based in DC. I'm co-chair of the Education Working Group, and I'm joined by Jenny Perlman Robinson with Brookings, who has graciously accepted to also serve as co-chair of the Education Working Group. So welcome, Jenny, and thank you so much for your time and your energy in this. So you'll see on your slide deck, and so for those of you who have not been able to join by video, we've emailed out the slides yesterday evening. We have a slightly updated deck that we'll be working from today. Please do not share out these slides any further, as some of the slides are for sort of our internal discussion purposes. If you would like to be able to share some of the content with your colleagues, I just ask that you reach out to either myself or Jenny, and we can provide you with a bit more guidance on how to do that. So in terms of the agenda for today, what we would like to focus on over this next hour and 5 minutes is a quick overview of the implications of the COVID-19 crisis on children's education and well-being. And while we are taking a strongly sort of education a stronger education focus, we know from our work that education is very much sort of sits at the intersection of many different sectors and areas, and that a comprehensive and effective education response to ensure continuity in children's education, their safety and their well-being, both through this crisis and in the many months and years beyond, will take a really cohesive and well-integrated effort from all sectors. We'd also like to pull from some lessons from the humanitarian sector. We have Rebecca Winthrop joining us from Brookings Institute, who will share some of her experiences over the years from the education and emergencies sector and what we can bring to bear to the COVID-19 crisis. And then we also have Mary Burns joining us from EDC, who will speak to some of the immediate needs and gaps in terms of what our partners in our partners in developing countries around the world need and the resources that they have available to them, and sort of what that has flagged for us in terms of gaps. And then we're going to open this up. I mean, throughout there will be space for discussion. There's a chat window that should be on the left of your screen. Please feel free to use that to type any questions or comments you'd like any of us to be able to address, if not now, then in future conversations. And we'll open up the conversation to think not just about the potential working group role in sorting out sort of immediate needs and gaps in resources, both information, funding and otherwise, but also some of the more medium and long-term needs and the role our working group can play. And then we will wrap up and discuss next steps, including the positioning of this webinar among other activities our working group would like to host this year, and some other fun bits. So please do try to stay on throughout the call. So I won't repeat, but in front of you again are some of the webinar objectives. In essence, to be able to share information about current education efforts that are underway in response to the COVID-19 crisis and how we can all learn from each other. There's a lot of really exciting initiatives ongoing, and we can't be involved in all of them, but some of us are involved in some of them. And so how can we kind of bring the best of what we're learning and doing to this space? And how can our working group specifically add value in the shorter and longer term efforts? Molly, I will turn it over to you.
Sure, thanks, Natika. Just to introduce myself quickly, I'm Molly Curtis from the Brookings Institution as well, and happy to just give a very quick overview of some of the immediate and anticipated impacts of the COVID-19 crisis, and particularly the school closures on children's learning and broader well-being, just as sort of a quick framing for our discussion later in the webinar. So if you want to switch to the next slide, Natika, just to turn to some of the immediate impacts of the school closures. I mean, of course, the biggest and the most obvious is the interrupted learning. As of 2 days ago, when I pulled these numbers, there's 1.57 billion affected learners, which is more than 90% of the total enrolled learners in the world, and 188 countrywide school closures. In addition to interrupting learning, we're also anticipating increased school dropouts, children who won't return to school after the school closures lift. And of course, expecting there to be exacerbated inequities in both access and quality. So of course, disproportionate challenges for girls, for refugee, displaced, and migrant children, for children with disabilities, children in low resource and remote contexts. Looking at the next slide, as Natika was saying, of course, we know that school closures don't just impact children's education, but their well-being more broadly. So one of the big issues is the interruption of school feeding programs. The World Food Program says that 368 million children are missing out on school meals every day, who often rely on that as a critical source of nutrition. We know there are greater child protection risks of schools being closed, including increased risks of domestic and sexual violence, neglect, child labor, forced marriage, and trafficking. And the UN Secretary General is already reporting on increased domestic violence during this time. And then lastly, and certainly not, these are not the only impacts, is the lack of access to the essential social services that are often provided at schools, including but certainly not limited to mental health care, psychosocial support, other health care such as vaccines. And we know that this is true not just in low and middle income countries, but really all around the world, including here in the United States, that children really depend on their schools, not just for an education, but critically also for other important services for their well-being, health, nutrition, and protection. Really quickly on the next slide, I can touch on some of the anticipated medium and long-term impacts, knowing we'll dig into this much more deeply later in the webinar. First and foremost, concerns of children being deprived of their right to education, and that there will be deeper ongoing inequities, both in access and learning. One in particular thinking about is this exacerbated gender inequality and how that will spill over into other aspects of girls' lives, such as early pregnancy and forced marriage. Of course, spillover effects of the economic hardships on families, including an exacerbation of intergenerational poverty, and then also potentially decreased funding for the education sector as more emphasis is put on other sectors. So, of course, this is certainly a tragedy for many people around the world, but we also know there are potential opportunities in crisis. I know Rebecca will touch on this a lot more later, so I won't go in depth, but just to say we've also been thinking about a few potential opportunities that could arise from this situation. Though, of course, we know this is not guaranteed, and there's certainly a risk that after this ends, education systems go right back to the status quo. But some potential opportunities for us to consider, as again, we discussed this later on, is potentially more space or appetite for innovation and experimentation in education systems, ways for education systems to be more resilient and better prepared for these types of emergencies and shocks. Certainly more data and learning about how remote education works, including ed tech. But also potentially greater parental engagement in education, and certainly a greater appreciation for the teaching profession and all that teachers give to our children. Other potential opportunities is greater national investment in internet connectivity and potentially more PPPs emerging as well. So lastly, we know that there's a lot happening in the education community in response to this crisis. I'm certainly not going to try and summarize it all. We know there's more financing, redirected financing, direct support to ministry of education, exploring new modalities for the continuity of learning, including digital and remote options. But one thing I wanted to touch on really quickly was a lot of people working on information sharing, and particularly efforts to collect, curate, and share resources, data, evidence, best practice on this continuity of learning options and also ways to support children's well-being during this time. So this is definitely a non-exhaustive list of resources, tools, and data that other organizations are collecting, curating, and sharing in response. There's certainly a lot more than this happening. This is just a snapshot, both from our own quick exploration as well as what all of you shared in the survey. So we can definitely share this list. I don't need to go into each one, but also just putting this out there for a conversation later, thinking about, is there a role or any utility in this working group helping to either share these resources more broadly or potentially assist field level actors with selecting from them, translating them, adapting them. So just something to think about. Really quickly, UNESCO, the World Bank, also I think GPE have been tracking the impact on education. INEE is compiling resources, but also hosting webinars and blog series, as well as the Global Education Cluster. UNICEF with the WHO and IFRC has issued guidance on prevention and control in schools. And then if you go to the next slide, you'll see a lot of others who are also compiling all sorts of resources, landscape analyses, tools, open resources, webinars for trainings in support of people trying to pivot and provide continuity of learning for children. So with that, I will turn it over to Jenny to take us on to the next section.
Great. Thanks so much, Molly. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Heather's nodding. Wonderful. Thank you. Our clairvoyant. No, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Jenny Perlman Robinson with Brookings. I'm just delighted to be joining you all today, and in particular to be joining Natika and co-convening the Education Working Group. I've been a big fan and participant over the past few years, and was really excited to join as co-convener, and very much looking forward to working with you all in the year ahead. And thank you, Molly, for that quite sobering overview, and as well as the resources that have been compiled. As Molly said, I think this is something we can talk about what role, if any, the working group can play in terms of coordination and sharing of information such as this. And certainly we'd be delighted to share this list and others after the call. I know some folks, such as myself, are having a difficult time joining Skype for Business via video. So I'd ask that maybe as our speakers go through their slides, you could just let us know and just say next for those of us who might be following on our own computers. I think that might be helpful. So we're going to divide up this conversation, or we'll see. It might just naturally flow into the other. But we thought, one, we'd start by talking a little bit about some of these immediate needs that we're seeing in the countries where we live and where we're working, and some of the potential responses that are already underway, where are some of the gaps, and then where the working group might consider contributing. And then we'll turn maybe the second half of the conversation that Natika will moderate, thinking a little bit more about some of these longer term implications of COVID-19 on children's learning, which, as Molly started to point out, unfortunately could have even greater repercussions than the immediate impacts we're seeing. And certainly, without downplaying the extent and the severity of the suffering, also an opportunity to think about how this crisis might provide opportunities to build more innovative and resilient education systems. So we're very fortunate to be joined to kick off the conversation by two of our working group members. I'm going to first turn it over to Rebecca Winthrop, Senior Fellow and Director at the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution. And she's going to share with us some thoughts about what it is that we might learn from other crises. Certainly, the Scaling Up Community of Practice group gives us the opportunity to think about learning from other sectors, as well as an opportunity to think about responses from past crises, and in particular from the experience in the humanitarian sector. So, Rebecca, I'd love to turn it over to you now to hear some brief thoughts on some of the lessons learned from education and emergencies. And then maybe we'll pause for a few quick questions and reflections before turning it over to Mary, our next speaker.
Rebecca, if you're talking, we can't hear you.
Okay, how's that?
Yeah, better.
All right. Thank you, Heather. Hi, everybody. Very nice to be here. You can go to the next slide, Natika. I really only have one slide for the folks who are not on video. And I have had deep work in the education and emergencies field prior to coming to Brookings, and I imagine actually some of you also have too. So I thought originally when this pandemic, over the course of the month of March, it became evident how serious it was going to be, that it would be helpful to just summarize some of the lessons learned from the education and emergencies field in terms of what is sort of standard basic principles that guide education response amid crisis, knowing that this crisis is a bit different from most of the crises that the education and emergencies field deal with, and hence these principles have derived out of. Usually, those who have worked in the humanitarian field know this well. We're talking about natural disasters, earthquakes, floods, or ongoing burbling armed conflict or civil war, etc. But the Ebola crisis, I think, and there has been lots of discussion of this in the media, etc., is kind of the more similar comparator. So anyways, I pulled out 4 big principles that I thought would be important for people to think about when they thought about education continuity activities amid COVID-19. They're bulleted there on the slide. And this, I'm just basically, for those of you who've read the piece I did called COVID-19 and School Closures, What Can Countries Learn from Past Emergencies? This will be very familiar, so I apologize. So the 4 principles are the following. First, one of the things that the education emergencies field does or aspires to do is begin education continuity activities. So restart education activities right away, not necessarily formal learning in a very structured way, but gathering young people with some sort of normalizing structured routine with a caring adult. And they do that for a couple of reasons. One is for supporting psychosocial well-being. We all know young people find routine routine and structure helpful. So we'll talk a little bit about that for the second principle. But the second reason is that it is a great way to make sure that all the young people, and hence young people as messengers to their families and adults in their lives, are getting the crucial life-saving messages. Usually in a crisis, the social fabric is changed, the context where people are living is changed, the normal sort of coping routines, how people go about their daily life has changed. That's obviously very true for COVID with social distancing. And, whether in past emergencies, whether it's you're at risk of cholera because, and you need to, train, make sure everyone knows how to use a pit latrine and where clean water sources to wash their hands and stay safe, or there's all of a sudden people in an area where there's landmines and how to avoid landmines. I mean, it could be anything. Those types of life-saving messages are really important. And in that case, it's really the public health community who is monitoring and creating those messages and partners with the education community to make them age appropriate, and then gives those messages to the teachers. It's not the teachers sort of sifting around an information and kind of coming up with what they think is important. And this could be happening in a number of countries, but I'd be curious if people have found that it is, if they could point me to it. I haven't found it a lot to be the case. So that's number 1. And number 2, a second principle from the education emergencies field is really this idea that you need to initiate your emergency response activities, yes, with an eye to what is right in front of you and what is needed, but absolutely with an eye to long-term children's development. So this means that you do have to think about how what you're doing, today, next week, the week after, is hopefully laying the foundation for children's learning and development over the medium long term. The other piece of this that I pulled out more for the the little report I wrote on Brookings is to really be honest with ourselves for how long it's going to take. I have always found, I don't think I've ever worked in an emergency, in an education and emergencies country context response where the initial estimated time for restarting, going back to normal education activities was shorter than predicted. It has always been longer. And so when people talk about, oh, well, maybe this is just for a week, a couple weeks, probably not. It's probably a couple months, and we should probably wrap our head around that and plan accordingly. In Ebola, it was 5 to 8 months. And you have to remember when, kids are home with their families, when it comes time for the public health officials to say, okay, we're going to open back up society and services, including education. Before kids can come back into the schools need to be disinfected. Teachers need to be likely, as they did in Ebola, trained on spotting possible COVID cases, and in Ebola, teachers were trained to take the temperature of kids before they entered the school building, to do hand washing before and after leaving. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's going to happen before kids can, once the crisis is over, or it's safe to regain normal life, once kids can actually walk through those school doors. So that's just to say, I would highly recommend trying to have a realistic time horizon, because that will help us also in designing the education continuity activities during this time. So that's the second one. The third principle, I had a bunch of principles. When I first wrote this piece, I had a bunch of principles, and I tried to wheedle them down because I tend to be long-winded. So I actually kind of combined two principles for this third one. So a third principle, which is, there's lots of evidence around this, is that continuing education is really continuing education activities amid a crisis is really, really important for children's resilience and well-being. And we know, those of you who work in fragile states or work on children's psychosocial well-being in these contexts, the IASC has guidelines for children's psychosocial well-being in crises. And we know that basically most kids are going to be fine if there's a resumption of sort of normal, sort of stabilizing routine and structure. It doesn't have to look exactly the same, but it sort of has to be a normalizing, stabilizing routine and structure. So educational activities fit right in there. And they have caring adults, or, contact with caring adults. There will be a smaller percentage of kids for whom that will not be enough. And Molly talked a lot about who those groups are. So kids who are really the most vulnerable, who really are at risk, for whom you need extra added programs. So, you could have kids in with abusive parents. You could have girls at risk of teenage pregnancy, child-headed households, really extremely poor kids. There's a wide range. And those kids will need extra programming and interventions. And then there's a really small percentage of kids for whom this crisis really disrupts their psychosocial well-being, and they do need more individualized mental health intervention, but usually not. That's only a really small percentage of kids. And one of the things that I think is different about this crisis, but quite positive, is that in a lot of other crises where these principles are derived from, kids, whole societies are disrupted, communities are torn apart, infrastructure is destroyed. And here, that's not the case. It's basically life as usual. You're just sequestered with your family. And one of the main things we know, one of the best things we can do in an emergency response is keep kids with their families. And so that's a positive. I think that's actually an asset. in terms of kids' psychosocial well-being in this crisis. So that is one strong principle, but there's of education emergencies, but there is a big caveat, which is the bullet on the screen, which is it really only holds true if you take a do no harm approach. And I imagine that a number of you use this approach in your work and are very familiar with it, but in case anybody is not, do no harm comes out of the Hippocratic Oath of the medical profession, but it was really instituted as a strong principle in humanitarian aid after Rwanda, after the Rwandan genocide, when it was clear that humanitarian intervention had unintended, unforeseen consequences that lengthened and the duration of the genocide, where food and aid supplies in refugee camps were being used by genocidaires to continue the fighting. So this do no harm principle is basically, in education emergencies, is continue education activities, but always try to think of those possible unintended consequences when you design your interventions. And people have talked a lot about it. Molly touched a lot on it. We can talk more about it. I imagine you guys have all thought about it. Some of the do no harm principles on increasing inequity. One of the ones I am really worried about is sort of, are we, as the entire world's children go in to some form of distance learning, for those who are doing it online, and this might not be a high percentage, frankly, in the developing world, it could be just sort of in the capitals, et cetera, are we opening them up to a whole bunch of child predators, online child predators like that? Are we going to find in a year that child predation online has gone through the roof? Is one. You guys can imagine many others. So that's, I think, incredibly important. And the final one, which again, I think you're all well aware of, is this idea of building back better, which is what is the opportunity for transformation post-crisis. Typically in past crises, you could have a big transformation around curriculum. I mentioned Rwanda before. That's certainly the case post-genocide in Rwanda. The textbooks and the curriculum were totally redone because pre-genocide there was lots of terrible stereotypes between the two ethnic groups, and lots and lots of other things got redone. That's just an example. So what are the opportunities that we might see can open up from the COVID pandemic experience? I'm actually quite curious to hear what you guys think. I'm not entirely sure that greater embracing of educational technology will sort of be a universal thing. I think it could go both ways. I think people could experience how badly ed tech helped them in this current response, because it was done very quickly. Governments or jurisdictions might not have been able to choose and source things that were effective. Teachers aren't trained. Many reasons why probably ed tech is kind of bad ed tech, and it could really turn people off from it, particularly educators, who at the end of the day are the ones who make or break a transformation. Are they going to actually practice it in the classroom? But people are talking a lot about that. Is it going to, open up for new innovations around ed tech? I think a second area of possibly building back better that I'm particularly interested in working on in Brookings that I don't hear a lot of people talking about is increased parent engagement in education. We know that parent engagement in education helps kids, most particularly the most marginalized and poorest. I'm sure there's others, such as preparedness, better preparedness with better preparedness plans, and a range of others, potentially. And then the question is, for all of you, I think, and for sort of the implementers, governments, et cetera, which are the ones that you most want to lean into? Because you will have to start thinking about that now and start working on it conscientiously in your responses. Your immediate responses. So with that, I will stop.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. I'm inspired by you both. I'm going to see if I can turn on my video. Is that working?
Yeah.
Oh, it's so nice. Okay, great. It's always nicer, right, to see a person than a circle. Thank you so much for that, Rebecca. And I thought maybe we take a few minutes right now and just see if folks have specific questions for Rebecca or the group. Take about 5 minutes or so before turning it over to Mary. In the chat box, I would ask maybe if folks could just queue up there by adding their name. I know there's a question from Johannes about are there lessons for how to respond to the crisis at scale? Whether something to learn from Ebola or SARS or previous humanitarian crises around how do we scale up quickly? So not just respond, but respond at the scope and magnitude that we need to. We're fortunate, Rebecca, you certainly might have some thoughts, but as you pointed out, we have a lot of colleagues on the call who have experience as well working in former humanitarian or responding to previous shocks and crises. So why don't I see if folks have some responses there. In the meantime, please others add to their questions. Johannes, anything to add on your question before we respond?
No, just to, I think the great strength of this particular working group is to sort of think through the scaling dimensions, both problems and opportunities, and sort of see are there lessons that we can apply both in the response to the crisis now, but then also longer term as we build back, as we try to get back to normal. It's, what strikes me that's unique about this is the scale of this this situation. And, so what do we need? What can we bring to the table when people are thinking about what to do? Are there lessons from the scaling perspective? That's really where I think we have a real opportunity and real obligation to sort of help others who perhaps haven't thought so much about the scale aspect. Thank you.
Thanks, Johannes. Why don't I see, Rebecca, if you have any thoughts there, and
Sure,
others.
I'm sure others might also have some thoughts, so they should jump in. But, in terms, I think it's actually a really good point, Johannes, and I would agree. In terms of the immediate response, the education response is already at scale because 188 countries have closed schools nationwide and are doing something. Some of them are taking school vacation. Some of them are, but most of them are moving to education continuity across their system. So it's already at scale. So you don't really have I don't think that's really where you're going to bring a scaling dimension. But what I do think you could think about is in the building back better phase, and it has to do with what you would have to do is identify what are places within a country's education system, education response. So are there jurisdictions, are there school networks, are there communities that are doing better than others? And there will be some obvious ones, which are those that are more connected, have more highly educated parents. Kids are just who have books in the home, etc. They're just going to do better. They're going to retain a lot of their knowledge. There's so much research, particularly in the U.S. and other developed countries, around the summer slide, where kids in summertime, if from middle class and up households, retain a lot of their literacy and numeracy, reading skills, and kids from poor households don't. So this is kind of a big version of that. In some ways, it's a big, or it's at risk of becoming. So, are there ways that communities are coping particularly well, and can those lessons be sort of scaled across the system upon resumption of sort of normal schooling activities? I guess that would be where I would say to focus.
Thanks, Rebecca. I don't know if others on the line just want to respond to Johannes's question about the scaling dimensions, in particular around the working group's response. maybe we'll hold that for the conversation after, because I think you're right, Johannes, to remind us sort of the value add in particular of this working group in the community of practice more broadly. I'm going to maybe ask for 2 more questions before we turn it over to Mary. Larry, could you ask your question, please, and then we'll turn to Kristen?
I can. I'm actually more interested in other people's questions than in my own, but my question actually worries about what goes on during the crisis itself. And 2 very specific things. One is, are we pretty confident that teachers will get paid, because they're a significant portion of the population themselves? And secondly, do we have any ideas as to what administrators, school administrators like principals, could most usefully be doing over this period to put the time to best use?
Thanks, Larry. Yeah, I was going to say, Mary might be responding to some of this in terms of what she's hearing and seeing from work with colleagues in country, but I don't know if others want to add to that.
This is Mary. I wasn't going to touch on that topic, and I don't have those answers, Larry, but in terms of teacher pay everywhere, but I do have information about teacher pay in private schools, low-cost private schools, because I'm actually doing some volunteering with teachers in Ecuador and Peru, where I used to live. And these are teachers at low-cost private schools, and they've actually their pay has been cut. So it's really layering on this devastation. Now, I don't know about national systems, public education systems, but at least in some of these low-cost private schools in Ecuador and Peru, these teachers have lost their pay.
I was afraid of that.
Larry, I would just say that I think I think administrators are pretty busy. Depending on what, if a system has said, we're just closing our doors, we're not doing much, then they won't be busy, but neither will the teachers. But if it's doing remote learning, they're pretty busy because it is new. It's been, there's been very little prep. You've basically gone from one day to the next to a totally different modality without teacher prep. There's lots of kinks. There's lots of problems. There's lots of logistical issues. So I think they're actually busy firefighting all this stuff. I don't think they're sitting at home twiddling their thumbs. That might not have been your angle of the question. But it maybe in the Build Back Better conversation with Marion, and the conversation might be helpful to think what you all think would be useful across multiple contexts for teachers and administrators to sharpen their skills or abilities around for building back better.
Yeah, Rebecca, I don't want to belabor this, but just to say that, and this is really more typically your point than mine, that people get so caught up in trying to deal with the crisis in the moment.
Yeah.
That it's been my experience that we tend to walk past a lot of things that really have a runway. So if you don't get started on them fairly early, you're unlikely to be able to do them later.
Exactly. Yep.
Well, maybe we return to that a bit, and when we respond a little bit to that question that you posed to us, Rebecca, about what opportunities do we see, either individually in our work or as a working group more broadly. Kristen, I think you had a question as well. You might be on mute.
I did, sorry. Yeah, I was just wondering if anybody has examples of how to best support parents during this time as well, because, well, and it's interesting because I wonder, I mean, like Rebecca said, this is a situation where life is continuing as normal for some people, and kind of everybody's staying at home, but they're staying at home with their children, and they have this dual burden now of working full time. And I know, at least in our case, that work has not meant that we're going slower or that things have slowed down in any way, shape, or form. In many ways, it's ramped up. And so I know there's this real dual burden on parents. And obviously, this is going to affect different families in different ways. But I was just curious if there are examples of that in other countries of how we have supported or can support parents as they kind of take on this dual burden and feel really overwhelmed by trying to homeschool as well as continue working and supporting the family.
Any lessons, Rebecca, or others from previous experiences?
Well, I think there's at the moment, I think the responses have been on several fronts. One is a curation of a bunch of resources. I think it really depends which countries we're talking about. In high-income countries, OECD context, which I'm not entirely clear if that's the area of the world that this working group cares about. Personally, at Brookings, we look at the whole world and share lessons across. But so in OECD countries, there's a ton of curation of resources for parents. So 1 million educational videos, 1 million, gamified stuff, sort of curated. So there's a lot of that going on and being sent out to parents. There's then legislation like in the US around the CARES Act, et cetera, where you can take extra additional family leave to care for a kid at home. But what I actually don't have as good sight lines on the developing world. And what I think is happening based on conversations and work with colleagues is that actually the social distancing stuff is not really very feasible in a lot of communities in the developing world. If you're thinking, rural sub-Saharan Africa, et cetera, I mean, it's just going to be very hard to social distance. One of our colleagues who runs the Africa Growth Initiative says, people are making a choice between certain do I social distance? And they're making a choice. I'll certainly starve if I do, certain death by certain starvation or possible death by catching COVID. And so they're choosing not to social distance. So that's a much larger issue. And I'm not sure what support is out there for parents, actually. I'd be curious what, civil society groups.
I would add, Rebecca, your point to this being a corollary to the Ebola response. So Save the Children and others who are working in that Ebola response were supporting radio stations to have teachers get on the radio and just narrate their lessons, and it gave the children a sense of normalcy to hear that cadence that sounded very much like their classrooms, as well as the community health workers who were going to home to make sure people were staying segregated, were bringing not only food and medicine, but they were also bringing learning materials that those students could use in their homes, because they knew that the parents were just not able to do homeschooling. So that radio and getting those hard copy materials into homes were really important in that response.
Thanks, Heather. I actually think that's a great segue to Mary's presentation, where I think she's going to touch upon interactive radio and other methods. I do want to say that we have a question from our colleague Gaith in Jordan. So maybe we can start with his question after Mary has a chance to present. That's along similar lines, I see. So Mary, we're going to turn to you. For those of you who might not know Mary Burns, she's a senior technologist with the Education Development Center. And she, as I mentioned, is working closely with colleagues in a number of countries and is going to share with us some of the needs that she and colleagues are seeing around the world, and particularly in some of these low resource environments that we know could potentially be most devastated and perhaps are least able to cope with the crisis, as well as some of the gaps there might be in the current response, and share thoughts on some potential way forward. So Mary, let me turn it over to you. And again, I'd ask if you could just let us know as you're advancing through your slides for those of us who can't follow online. And as folks have questions or thoughts, please put it in the comment box. Thanks, Mary.
Sure. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, everyone. You can advance this one. Yeah, and you can advance this one. Next. So briefly, what I'm going to do this morning is I'll just talk about really what's happening with distance education very broadly, some of the issues moving forward. And I've decided to really organize this by themes, and I really have 9 themes, so I'll get right to them. And theme 1, and you can move ahead. Sorry. Next. Theme 1 is that, let's see. I don't know if you can see it on your screen. I can see it on mine, but most countries have turned to online learning, and I say, well, that's the plan anyway. And I'll just use the United States as an example. We have 13,000 school districts, 100,000 public schools. 47 of our states have closed schools, and we have 54 million kids out of school right now. And in the richest country in the world, most school districts right now are not providing online instruction to students. In fact, most school districts are providing no education to their students right now. Most districts in the US do not have the capacity to provide online learning to students. So if you go to the next slide, we don't have it, which is theme 2, which is how we define online learning right now. There is online learning, but we have to have a very fluid taxonomy of what constitutes online learning. And so there's not a lot of data right now, but there are organizations that are starting to build data about how kids are receiving education in the time of COVID. So what I've done is put together my own quite ugly and strangely colored, it seems, pyramid on what I've seen in terms of, and I'm hearing about in terms of what kids are receiving. And essentially you can see it's an inverted pyramid where most kids are not receiving online learning. Anything from offline work with some teacher check-ins to districts sending out access to lists of curated information or playlists, or sending curriculum resources with no instruction, or suggesting resources, third-party resources like PBS Learning Media. At the very bottom of the pyramid, you will see that there is some instruction via webinars, and I think at the very
I lost Mary. Can
Me
others?
too.
Oh, yeah.
I've lost Mary also.
Mary, we can't hear you.
Maybe while we're waiting.
I'm back.
Oh, great.
Sorry.
Perfect.
That's like getting the hook on a stage.
No, it's not coming from us.
Oh my God.
Yeah, we certainly did not mute you.
No, not at all. Please continue, Mary.
In any event, I'm not sure where, but at the very bottom of this pyramid, you can see that some districts, these are the wealthy BYOD one-to-one districts. It's like nothing's changed. Full instructional delivery, support, assessment, monitoring via something like, which they can do at home through Google Classrooms or a learning management system. But these are the minorities. So if you move on, next slide. I'm supposed to be in Brazil this week. And so actually I was kind of curious to see. Brazil also is saying that it's doing online learning. And Brazil, like the United States, has a very decentralized system. And it has 26 states, about 5,500 municipalities. And I looked at some data on Brazil, and right now only 10% of districts say they have a structured system in place to deliver some kind of distance learning to students. So you can see that at the 50,000 feet level, yes, countries are doing online learning, but when you actually get down into the details themselves, you see, no, this is not really happening. If you move to the next slide, I would say that theme 3 is that, we know this already, that online learning alone will not provide kids across the global education. It's going to need some help from old friends. So I use Peru just very quickly here as a case study. Peru has 89% household connectivity to the internet. And so it set up a program called Aprendo en Casa, which was an online learning program to deal with COVID-19. And they started with COVID-19 quite early. But they realized that they had to have a 2-track system for the 10% of rural households that have internet access, and for a number of poor families that might have internet, urban poor families, but they have really weak internet. So if you move to the next slide, I just say it's back. You got to hit next again. It's television. Television is back. It's amazing. You have to click next. If you can hit next, there you go. It's not just for Netflix anymore. Educational TV has had a huge renaissance. All 50 US states right now are broadcasting educational TV programming through PBS. France is using France 4 to broadcast educational programming throughout France. Educational TV programming is being broadcast it's really helpful in countries that have a national curricula, and it's being broadcast across the globe via state-owned subscription educational TV programming. Next, please. Go to the next slide. And radio is also having a renaissance. So in 2018, I did a study for the MasterCard Foundation on EdTech in Sub-Saharan Africa, and I asked donors, governments about IRI, interactive radio instruction, and radio instruction in general, and they said to me, it's too old, it's too expensive, it's not modern enough. And so as I was in Sub-Saharan Africa looking at educational technology, except for Cape Verde, I really couldn't find countries that were using radio robustly. That has changed. It is back in a big way because we know that in Sub-Saharan Africa, 80 to 90% of households have access to radio. It has a massive reach. And so what we're seeing is educational programming through broadcast radio, through radio dramas, and through interactive radio instruction, which I'll talk about right now. Next. So this is an EDC slide. It just shows interactive radio instruction across the globe. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with it, but and I'll touch on it afterwards if you have questions, but it was developed by Stanford University in the 1970s, used throughout Asia, Africa, Latin America, Caribbean to provide in-class interactive direct instruction to children in areas of conflict where there's no teacher, where teachers don't speak the language. It's the only educational technology that has a long body of rigorous research behind it. Next slide. So because IRI uses very engaging and relevant characters and storylines, songs, etc., to coach parents and teachers, what we're seeing is that even places that have strong television infrastructure and one-to-one laptop programs like Lagos State are also using radio right now for educational broadcasting and for call-in tutoring, again, because of its reach and because people own it. Next. So I'll just move on to a fourth theme. So these, I don't know what you can see. Your screen is very different from mine. But I think Molly has mentioned this, others have mentioned this, and theme 4 really is that COVID-19 is not just a health crisis, it's an education crisis. It's potentially devastating education systems. It's being borne by the poorest students and the poorest families in the world. And there's just so many kids right now we're not reaching, kids with disabilities, special needs learners, refugees, poor children. And that's not just in poor countries, that's in rich countries too. Next slide. And so I think theme 5 is really that a lot of this crisis could have been avoided. So unscientifically, I counted since 2001, we've had 7 major world crises that I know of, mainly terrorist-related, epidemiological, or weather-related, from 9/11 to SARS to our snowmageddon here in the Northeast that closed schools for 6 weeks. But here we are in 2020, almost everywhere in the world, struggling to continue to provide education to kids. And I think we've treated internet infrastructure as something rich countries get, but in fact, it is what poor countries need. And because of this failure to plan and to invest in technology infrastructure and to build an educational technology system, education has become really kind of a household-based, laissez-faire endeavor. If you go to the next slide, and that leads to this theme 6, which again, I'm not sure you can see very well, but as a result of this, the initial results of online learning are not very pretty. Teachers don't know how to teach online. Kids don't know how to learn online. Rebecca touched on the privacy issue earlier, but we see this lack of planning, design really leads to this impoverished learning experience. And online learning has proved to be exclusionary, not inclusionary. It's not serving kids with special needs. We haven't invested in technology training with teachers or for students. And so we see people really struggling, and we see a real disarticulation between what happens in the classroom, the physical classroom, and what's happening online. And I think as a result of this, if you move to the next slide, this leads to theme 7. And again, Rebecca touched on this, is within households, we see these new patterns of educational inequity being layered over old ones. So, school now is in the domain of households, and it's the province of parents and caregivers. It's turned them into de facto teachers and principals. But many of these parents, they're poor people. They can't socially isolate. The digital divide causes all kinds of divides. So, schools in poor communities are less likely to have technology at home. They'll have to share technology. Parents are less likely to understand the technology. Poor immigrant parents like mine, for example, are intimidated by school. They don't understand school. They weren't educated themselves. And as Rebecca mentioned, parental engagement is really key to student learning. And we see now that with remote learning, part of that engagement involves parents having basic digital literacy skills so that they know how to be engaged in their own kids' learning. So I'll move on to the next one. So I think this leads to theme 8, which is, for me, really technology has to be an integral part of a national education system. You know, I'm one of these people who engaged in these arguments about whether ed tech is worth it to improve learning. I think we have to dispense with that. We see that technology offers scale, it offers access and uninterrupted education during crises like this. And I think it's really time to leverage the technology people own for education purposes. And as a community of practice focused on scale, I think focusing on technology infrastructures, whether it's radio, TV, but certainly digital infrastructure, and helping people understand scale could be one of our efforts. And for theme 9, I'll really leave it to you, but I just don't see, I think you all know better than I do, I don't see international donor aid the way it is now, equipped to deal with a post-pandemic world. Because I think in many cases, we are going to have to rebuild national education systems. And so we do these projects, but they're small scale, which is why we have trouble scaling. And I think we'll need long-term sector-wide approaches with donors working together. So I'll move on to the next slide, which is just to say that, you know, my work at EDC and with EDC is there's a lot of technical assistance right now. And we provide a lot of technical assistance, especially around interactive audio and radio instruction, especially with online learning. And so these are a few resources that you'll be able to find if this is something you're looking for on your site. And just thank you all very much and conclude here. You can go to the next slide. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. A wealth of sort of insights and information and recommendations for us all to consider, and a lot to pack in, I know, in a short period of time. I'm going to do a quick sort of very public and virtual time check to my co-convener. Nitika, is it okay if we take the next sort of 10 minutes for our conversation and then turn it to you to help us wrap up?
Absolutely. And I was going to say maybe we could combine our conversations around immediate, medium, longer term, just kind of reactions to presentations. Let's just get it all in.
I think that's great. I think that's great. And then they've all sort of understandably sort of blended. So I'm going to first apologize to Heather. You had an earlier question around data collection and tracking and what we should be looking at, as well as a tool that you all have been working on. So why don't I turn to you? And then Guy, great to hear your question, although it sounds like through Mary's conversation, there might have been some responses there as well. So Heather, to you, please.
Thanks, Jenny. Yeah, and to Rebecca or the group, just curious, what data should we be collecting right now to help us in this pivot to education emergencies? Right now, Room to Read has been retooling one of our risk and response protocols that we use in our girls' education programming. Initially, it was designed to identify girls at risk of dropping out of school. Right now, we're trying to refocus it to the current circumstances to find those girls who are at risk of not going back to school once schools reopen. But I'd love to know if there are other data that we should be collecting and tracking to help us during this phase.
I bet Mary has lots of examples, so I'll be very brief. My sort of recommendation would be to go to the IME minimum standards, which I think you guys would all know well. And there's a whole section in there around data collection. So some of it's going to be relevant, very, very relevant, but some of it won't be. So you'll have to check that out. But I think your intuition, Heather, is right. You really want to parse out how different young people are faring, because in any crisis, the most vulnerable and the folks who are really kind of at the bottom of the heap in terms of well-being and resources always fare worse than those who have resources. Even in a thing like a flood where it wipes everybody's house out, they still end up faring better. So I think that's a really important piece. And then there's other dimensions around learning and access and stuff, but also the psychosocial and child protection pieces are probably two important parts.
Thanks, Rebecca.
I'm sorry, I was responding to Larry's question in the text about teacher resistance. So can you ask the question again?
Yeah, Mary, I was just asking what data we should be looking for or tracking right now to help sort of inform our programming as well as our supports during this emergency period.
It would be interesting to see, this is a question for the group, but I do really see, to me, the big digital divide right now, education divide, is between kids who have access to technology and kids who don't. And to see, what are we learning? Who's using radio, who's using TV? What are we seeing in terms of maintaining educational outcomes or engagement? I don't know the exact indicators, but I do think we need to, or I would suggest, I shouldn't say we need to, I'm a hammer, so everything looks like a nail to me, but, any kind of data on educational technology, and especially what we're seeing in terms of what people need in order to be able to use this technology effectively.
Can I add one more that I think we don't usually do, but has been in education and crisis context, we've learned it's really, really important. And I think Larry was getting at it, is teacher well-being. Because teachers are dealing with the crisis like every other parent and have their own kids. And if they aren't supported to be able to support the learning of their kids, the system becomes really fragile.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Heather. Guys, anything to share or add from the experience in Jordan and some of your questions around do no harm and ways to engage those more remote populations?
Yeah, hi.
Hi, we hear you.
Yeah, how is everything? Actually, what Mary just said has brought to me a lot of ideas of why not engaging the local radio stations, which are scattered all over Jordan. It's either based in universities or in municipalities, etc. So why not engaging the radio stations, since they are community radio stations, so there are no profits, etc. So maybe we can do something in cooperation with the Ministry of Education on engaging the teachers more in the teaching learning process for the students in the schools. What we are doing so far is video lessons to the financial education program, which is mainstreamed in all over schools in Jordan. So it has been hard for us because all the COVID-19 came all of a sudden. We do not have limited resources or no resources at all for this digital transformation that we just stumbled at. So what we are doing is only video classes. We are using the same people who develop the content, develop the curriculum of the financial education. They are the ones who are recording these lessons. But we are doing, given the circumstances, we are doing such a great job, actually. Everything is going well so far, but the do no harm approach should be always in mind when we talk about the digital divide between students and the less fortunate students who do not have access to internet or even to TV sets in their own houses, which is very important.
Wonderful, thank you. Mary, yes.
I was just going to add something to that and just say that it's interesting, my camera keeps going on and off. Hello. Radio is not an elixir. It has to be designed well. And that's why I think interactive radio instruction is quite good. Of course, interactive radio instruction kind of tops out at certain ages. So a couple of things. One is we know that, people broadcast radio is a lot less effective than interactive radio instruction. We know that radio dramas are actually quite effective in terms of changing behaviors and promoting certain kinds of, pro-social behaviors. Like right now, there's a lot of misinformation going around on the COVID virus. I was actually talking with a Brazilian colleague yesterday. I'm supposed to be in Brazil, and I was actually telling her about how you get it and the symptoms. So she's my age and she's a professional woman. And so I think that's, radio dramas are great for something like kind of those behaviors. So what I wanted to say is that Education Development Center, where I work, is making our radio program available to countries. Now, I don't know if available means at no cost, but I'd be happy to connect you to someone in the organization. And UNICEF, too, I think, is also making its radio programming available for free. But I'd be happy to connect you also to folks at EDC and see if there's something that they could provide that would be useful in Jordan.
Yes, great, thanks. I just want to add a little, one last note before I mute again. Jordan has been working on this EdTech strategy for the education. The Ministry of Education has been working on this EdTech strategy. I was thinking of how us as individuals and the government and the system itself, how everything was taken for granted, that we just took it as slow as possible. It should have been implied like last year, but given some circumstances, it was postponed until the next year. I was thinking if it was put in place since last year, how things would have been so much different now. And that's it.
Thanks, Guy. Absolutely. And Rebecca's point of the hastily nature of responding to the crisis and some of the consequences of that. And we'll certainly make sure to connect you to Mary after this call. I'm conscious that we have 3 more minutes and some really good questions. Kim around connecting resources to the curriculum, Larry around teachers' resistance to technology, but I might take moderator prerogative and just quickly turn back to you, Johannes. You thanked Mary for the connection between technology and scale, and I'm wondering if you, and I'd welcome others' thoughts about kind of bringing it back to this working group and what we might be able to do and contribute, in particular some of the lessons that we might have learned around scaling. Would you maybe, Johannes, just share any quick thoughts, and I'd invite others before we turning it over to Natika to wrap us up.
Thank you very much, Jenny. No, I don't really have any constructive thoughts since education is not my specialty. But I think this notion that, technology is actually a great multiplier and a great scalar in the education field, both in emergencies like this one, but perhaps also for the longer term, plus thinking hard about how we deal with the last mile problem then, because that's obviously a huge issue when you think about technology in education. So I think those aspects I found really very interesting from a scaling perspective. And again, to the extent we in this group have a special role to play, perhaps focusing on the scaling, both in terms of obstacles and challenges, but also in terms of opportunities, would be great from my perspective. Thank you, and thanks for organizing this wonderful call. I really appreciate it. Over.
Thank you, Johannes. Well, Natika, I'm going to turn it back over to you, and maybe we can just think about how we can continue this conversation, because certainly a lot more questions we didn't have a chance to get to.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for joining this morning. I want to thank Natalie for helping kind of organize the webinar and the slide deck. And of course, Jenny, thank you so much for co-chairing this working group and helping and preparing for this webinar. Molly, thank you for the fantastic slides you put together and the background information on COVID-19. And of course, Rebecca and Mary, thank you both so much for volunteering to share some of the lessons you've learned and been learning, and how we can apply this to the work that we're all currently engaged in. There is obviously so much more that we could talk about. We could, I'm sure, spend days together sort of digesting what we've heard today and thinking through ways to apply this to our work, and then more broadly, what kind of concrete activities or materials this working group could play a role in generating and sharing. And so that is part of the conversation that I would certainly love for us to continue. There are a couple of other also sort of smaller fun bits. Like, for example, we've been asked to come up with an icon for the education working group and sort of a visual for our group, a photo that sort of demonstrates kind of the work that our education working group is engaged in. And so we'll send out sort of a call for sample your kind of proposed icons and photos, and maybe we can make that kind of a fun vote for working group members. That'll be another quick activity for our group in the coming weeks. But in the meantime, I think as an immediate next step, we'll collate some of the questions and key discussion points that emerged from this webinar. We'll link that to a recording of the webinar and send that out to the broader Scaling Up community of practice for those who couldn't join. And we will definitely be in touch. We'd love to, for those of you who weren't able to share your ideas, any ideas, desires, priorities you all have for how this working group could serve as a convener, facilitator, sharer of information, a place for us to dialogue. We'd really welcome your ideas and suggestions. So please don't hesitate to get in touch with either myself or Jenny or Larry and share those thoughts. So with that, I guess we'll just close. Thank you all so much for joining. I hope you're all safe and healthy and have a wonderful Thursday. Heather, you were right. The sun has emerged here in DC now. Sunny skies. So thank you for that prediction.
I really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all so much. Be safe.
Bye.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.